War Machine. His legal name is Jonathan Koppenhaver. He fought in the UFC in 2007 under the name War Machine after legally changing it. He went 1-1 in the promotion before being released. He then fought in Bellator and on regional shows. On August 8, 2014, Koppenhaver broke into the Las Vegas home of his ex-girlfriend, adult film actress Christy Mack. Mack's friend Corey Thomas was also in the apartment. Koppenhaver beat Thomas unconscious and then turned on Mack. He beat her for nearly 2 hours. Mack suffered 18 broken bones, a ruptured liver, a lacerated kidney, and lost several teeth. She required extensive reconstructive surgery. Koppenhaver fled the scene and was a fugitive for 10 days before being apprehended at a hotel in Simi Valley, California. In March 2017, he was found guilty on 29 of 34 charges, including sexual assault, kidnapping, and coercion. He was sentenced to 36 years to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 36 years. He will be eligible for parole in 2050 at the earliest. Jon Jones, the hit and run. On April 26, 2015, Jon Jones was the reigning UFC light heavyweight champion, widely considered the greatest fighter on the planet. At approximately noon that day in Albuquerque, New Mexico, Jones ran a red light and crashed his rental car into a vehicle driven by a pregnant woman. The woman suffered a broken arm. Jones fled the scene on foot. Witnesses saw him return to the vehicle briefly and grab a handful of cash and a marijuana pipe before running away again. He did not check on the other driver. He did not call for help. The pregnant woman was treated at a hospital and her baby was later born healthy. Jones was arrested and charged with felony hit and run. He pleaded guilty to a charge of leaving the scene of an accident. He was sentenced to 18 months of supervised probation. The UFC stripped him of his light heavyweight title. It was the beginning of a pattern that would define his career as much as his fighting ability. Jon Jones, domestic violence. On September 24, 2021, hours after being inducted into the UFC Hall of Fame in Las Vegas, Jon Jones was arrested at Caesars Palace. He was charged with misdemeanor domestic violence after allegedly headbutting his fiancée, Jessie Moses. He was also charged with felony injuring or tampering with a vehicle after allegedly damaging a Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department vehicle. Police body camera footage showed Jones with blood on his clothes. Moses was reportedly found with blood on her face and clothing. Jones was released on bail. The domestic violence charge was eventually resolved through a plea agreement. This was not an isolated incident. Jones has had multiple encounters with law enforcement over the years, including DUI arrests and a separate incident in 2019, where he was accused of slapping a waitress at a strip club in Albuquerque. Each time, the UFC has allowed him to return after serving his suspension. He remains on the active roster. Joe Son. Joe Son fought at UFC 4 in December 1994 in Tulsa, Oklahoma. He was Keith Hackney's opponent in a bout that is remembered primarily for Hackney repeatedly striking Son in the groin, which was legal at the time. That fight is a curiosity in early UFC history. What happened after Joe Son's fighting career is not. In 2008, Son was arrested in connection with a gang rape that had occurred on Christmas Eve in 1990 in Orange County, California. The victim, a 20-year-old woman, had been abducted from a parking lot, driven to a remote location, and sexually assaulted by multiple men over the course of several hours. DNA evidence linked Son to the crime nearly 18 years after it was committed. He pleaded guilty to 1 count of sexual penetration by a foreign object in 2011 and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. While incarcerated in 2011, Son murdered his cellmate. He stomped the man to death. He was charged with first-degree murder and is serving an additional sentence. Joe Son is one of the most horrific figures in the history of combat sports, and his name is a reminder that the UFC's earliest days had virtually no vetting of the people they allowed into the octagon. Abel Trujillo. Abel Trujillo fought 11 times in the UFC lightweight division between 2012 and 2018. His record in the promotion was 6-5, with notable fights against Tony Ferguson, Gleison Tibau, and Jamie Varner. In November 2019, Trujillo was arrested on federal charges related to child sexual exploitation. He was charged with receiving and distributing material depicting the sexual exploitation of minors. He pleaded guilty and in 2020 was sentenced to 66 months in federal prison. The case received limited attention in the MMA media at the time. Trujillo had already been released from the UFC before his arrest and was fighting on smaller regional shows. The details of the federal case are a matter of public record, and they are deeply disturbing. Evan Tanner. Evan Tanner won the UFC middleweight championship at UFC 51 in February 2005 by knocking out David Terrell in the first round. He was a self-taught fighter who had driven from Amarillo, Texas to the West Coast with no money and no connections, and worked his way into the UFC through sheer determination. He lost the middleweight title to Rich Franklin in his first defense and continued fighting in the UFC until 2008. On September 5, 2008, Tanner went camping alone in the Anza Borrego Desert in Southern California, near the town of Palo Verde. He had posted on his MySpace page beforehand about about wanting to go into the desert to clear his head and find some peace. Temperatures in the area were above 110 degrees. On September 8, 2008, Tanner's body was found by search and rescue teams. He had died of heat exposure. His motorcycle had run out of fuel and he was miles from the nearest road. An investigation determined that he had been struggling with depression and alcoholism. He was 37 years old. The MMA community mourned him as one of the most genuine and well-liked people in the sport. Tim Hague. Tim Hague fought 3 times in the UFC between 2010 and 2011. He won his debut against Pat Barry by TKO and then lost his next 2 bouts, including a knockout loss to Joey Beltran. He was released from the UFC and continued fighting in regional MMA and boxing. On June 16, 2017, Hague fought boxer Adam Braidwood in a professional boxing match in Edmonton, Alberta. Hague was knocked down multiple times during the fight. The referee stopped the contest in the second round after Hague was knocked down for the final time. He walked back to his corner under his own power. Shortly after, he collapsed and was rushed to hospital. He was placed in a medically induced coma. Tim Hague died on June 18, 2017, 2 days after the fight. The cause of death was brain injury. He was 34 years old. His death prompted calls for improved medical protocols in combat sports, particularly in the Canadian provinces where boxing and MMA regulations varied significantly. His son published a statement that read in part that his father died doing what he loved. Jordan Parsons. Jordan Parsons was a 25-year-old Bellator featherweight with a professional MMA record of 11-2. He was one of the most promising young fighters in the promotion. On May 1, 2016, Parsons was crossing the street outside a bar in Delray Beach, Florida, when he was struck by a car traveling at high speed. The driver, who had a blood alcohol content nearly 3 times the legal limit, fled the scene. Parsons was rushed to hospital with severe injuries. His left leg was amputated. He died the following day from his injuries. The driver was eventually arrested and charged with DUI manslaughter and leaving the scene of an accident involving death. In 2018, the driver pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 12 years in Florida State Prison. Parsons had fought just 8 days earlier at Bellator 153, winning by submission. His teammates at MMA Masters in Florida were devastated. His death was a senseless tragedy that had nothing to do with fighting. Pat Barry and Rose Namajunas. Pat Barry was born in July 1979. Rose Namajunas was born in June 1992. That is a 13-year age gap. In interviews, both Barry and Namajunas have confirmed that they first met when Namajunas joined the Rufasport gym in Milwaukee, Wisconsin as a teenager. She was 14 years old. Barry was a professional MMA fighter in his late 20s who was training at the same facility. The exact timeline of when their romantic relationship began has been disputed. Barry has said in multiple interviews that they were friends first and that the relationship started when Namajunas turned 18. Critics and members of the MMA community have questioned the dynamics of an adult professional fighter developing a relationship with a teenage training partner, regardless of when it became officially romantic. Barry and Namajunas are now married. Namajunas became a 2-time UFC strawweight champion and one of the most successful female fighters in MMA history. The conversation about the age gap and the circumstances of their meeting has persisted throughout her career and Barry's. Diego Sanchez and Joshua Fabia. Diego Sanchez won the first season of The Ultimate Fighter in 2005 and fought in the UFC for 16 years across 4 weight classes. He was one of the most beloved fighters in the promotion's history, known for his heart, his intensity, and his yes cartwheel entrance. Then in 2019, he began working with a man named Joshua Fabia. Fabia had no professional fighting experience. He had no verifiable coaching credentials. He ran a self-defense school called School of Self-Awareness in Albuquerque. Bizarre training videos began surfacing on social media showing Fabia having Sanchez stand still while Fabia threw slaps and strikes at his face. The videos were widely mocked. Fabia began accompanying Sanchez to UFC events and clashing with UFC officials. He demanded Sanchez's complete medical records from the UFC, which the promotion viewed as preparation for a potential lawsuit. In 2021, the UFC released Sanchez from his contract, citing concerns about Fabia's influence. Sanchez's final years in the sport were overshadowed entirely by Fabia's presence and the widespread belief that a man with no qualifications had taken advantage of a fighter who was clearly in decline. Greg Hardy. Greg Hardy was a Pro Bowl defensive end for the Carolina Panthers in the NFL. In May 2014, he was convicted of assaulting and threatening to kill his ex-girlfriend, Nicole Holder. Holder testified that Hardy threw her onto a futon covered in assault rifles and told her he would kill her. Hardy appealed the conviction and requested a jury trial. Holder did not appear for the jury trial, and the charges were dismissed. Hardy's NFL career effectively ended. In 2018, Dana White gave Hardy a spot on the Contender Series, the UFC's developmental show. Hardy won by TKO and was offered a UFC contract. The signing was controversial. Multiple fighters and media members questioned why the UFC was giving a platform to a man who had been convicted of domestic violence. White defended the decision by saying Hardy deserved a second chance. Hardy went 7-5 in the UFC with 3 wins by TKO and was released from the promotion in 2022. He never acknowledged wrongdoing in the domestic violence case, CTE the silent crisis. Spencer Fisher fought 21 times in the UFC between 2004 and 2012. He won 12 of those fights. He was known as the King. In 2021, ESPN published a feature on Fisher's life after fighting. He could barely remember the names of his children. He struggled to form complete sentences. He could not hold a job. He walked with a limp from nerve damage. He was 45 years old and his cognitive function had declined to the point where he needed assistance with basic daily tasks. Fisher's story is not unique. Multiple retired UFC fighters have reported similar symptoms. Forrest Griffin, the winner of The Ultimate Fighter Season 1, has spoken openly about memory problems. Gary Goodridge, who fought at UFC 8, was diagnosed with dementia pugilistica and requires full-time care. The UFC does not fund a CTE research program. The promotion's revenue exceeds $1 billion annually. Major professional sports leagues, including the NFL and NHL, have established CTE research funds and concussion protocols after facing similar scrutiny. The UFC has not. Fighters who competed in the early and mid-2000s when medical stoppages were less frequent, and fighters regularly competed multiple times per month, are now dealing with the long-term consequences of that era. Fighter pay. In 2021, a class-action antitrust lawsuit brought by former UFC fighters alleged that the UFC had engaged in anti-competitive practices that suppressed fighter pay. During discovery, documents revealed that UFC fighters received approximately 16 to 20% of the promotion's total revenue. For comparison, NBA players receive approximately 50% of league revenue. NFL players receive approximately 48%. Major League Baseball players receive approximately 45%. No major professional sport in the United States pays its athletes a smaller share of revenue than the UFC. Preliminary card fighters earn as little as $12,000 to show and $12,000 to win. That is $24,000 before taxes, training expenses, coaching fees, and medical costs for a fight that requires months of preparation and carries the risk of serious physical injury. The lawsuit was settled in 2024 for $335 million. The UFC admitted no wrongdoing. Fighter pay has increased since the settlement, but the fundamental revenue split has not changed significantly. The UFC remains the only major sports promotion in the world where athletes routinely earn less than 20% of the revenue they generate. Kane Velasquez, the shooting. On February 28, 2022, Kane Velasquez, the former two-time UFC heavyweight champion, was arrested for attempted murder in Morgan Hill, California. The incident began when a man named Harry Goulart was charged with sexually molesting Velasquez's 4-year-old son at a daycare facility operated by Goularte's mother. After learning of the charges, Velasquez followed a vehicle carrying Goularte and his stepfather, Paul Bender Kaser, in an 11-mile car chase through the streets of Morgan Hill. Velasquez fired multiple gunshots at the vehicle. He did not hit Goulart. He hit Kaser, who survived the shooting with non-life-threatening injuries. Velasquez was arrested at the scene and charged with attempted murder, shooting at an occupied vehicle, and assault with a deadly weapon. He spent 8 months in Santa Clara County Jail before being released on bail in November 2022. He was placed on house arrest. In 2025, Velasquez pleaded no contest to attempted murder and related charges. He was sentenced to 5 years in state prison. The case divided the MMA community. Many fighters and fans expressed sympathy for Velasquez's motives, while acknowledging that firing a gun on a public street near a school endangered innocent lives. Goulart's case is still pending in the courts. Scott Smith. Scott Smith was losing. Not close. Losing. Pete Sell had cracked him with a body shot that folded him in half at UFC Fight Night 6 in November 2006. Smith was on the canvas. His face was twisted in pain. His hand was on his stomach. Sell walked in to finish him because the fight was already over. Everyone knew it. The crowd knew it. The commentators knew it. Smith was about to get stopped. Then Smith threw one punch off his back foot while still wincing from the body shot and caught Sell flush on the chin. Sell dropped face first, out cold. Smith stood over him holding his stomach because the body shot pain had not even worn off yet. The fight ended with the winner still recovering from the shot that was supposed to end him. That is the comeback that defined an era. You can be 1 second away from losing and 1 punch away from winning at the same time. Scott Smith proved it. Anderson Silva. Anderson Silva was getting beaten by Chael Sonnen for 4.5 rounds at UFC 117 in August 2010. Not edged, not nudged, beaten. Sonnen took him down in the first round and kept him there. Took him down again in the second. Took him down in the third. Took him down in the fourth. Silva was on his back absorbing punches and elbows for 23 minutes of a 25-minute fight. The greatest middleweight in UFC history was about to lose his title to a wrestler nobody thought could even get close to him. Then, with 1 minute and 50 seconds left in the 5th round, Silva caught Sonnen's arm. He threw his legs up. He locked in a triangle. Sonnen capped. The greatest title reign in UFC history stayed alive because Silva refused to lose even when the fight was already lost. 23 minutes of getting beaten, 2 minutes of being a champion. That is who Anderson Silva was. That is why people called him the greatest. The fight you were watching was already decided. He decided it again at the end. Frankie Edgar. Frankie Edgar got dropped in the first round against Gray Maynard at UFC 125 on New Year's Day 2011. Then he got dropped again. Then again. Maynard knocked him down 4 separate times in the first round. Edgar should have been finished. Most fighters get knocked down once and they are done. Edgar got knocked down 4 times and walked back to his corner at the end of the round like nothing happened. Then he came out for round 2 and started boxing. He used his speed, he used his footwork, he outpointed Maynard for the next 4 rounds, and the fight ended in a draw. Edgar kept the title. The first round was one of the most one-sided rounds in UFC championship history. The next 4 were a different fight entirely. Then they fought again at UFC 136. Same thing. Maynard dropped him in the first. Edgar came back. This time, Edgar finished him by TKO in the 4th round. 2 title fights against the same opponent. 2 near finishes in the first round, 2 comebacks. Frankie Edgar built his entire career on the idea that the first round does not count if you survive it. Nobody embodied that more. Cheick Kongo. Cheick Kongo got punched in the face. Then he got punched in the face again. Pat Barry was a former kickboxer with knockout power in both hands, and at UFC Live in June 2011, he was unloading on Kongo against the cage in the first round. Barry dropped him with a left hook. Kongo got up. Barry dropped him again with another left hook. Kongo got up again. He was barely conscious. His legs were stiff. His eyes were not tracking. Barry walked in to finish the fight. Kongo threw one right hand from somewhere outside reality and connected flush on Barry's chin. Barry dropped face first. The fight was over. Kongo had been hit cleaner than Barry. He had been dropped twice. He had no business winning. He won anyway. The replay still does not look real. 2 seconds before the punch, Kongo could barely stand. 2 seconds after the punch, Barry could not stand at all. That is the kind of finish that does not happen in real fights. Cheick Kongo made it happen. Travis Brown was getting kicked in the leg. That was the entire fight. Alistair Overeem at UFC Fight Night in August 2013 was landing hard kicks to the leg and body, and Brown was wincing every time. By the middle of the first round, Brown was hurt. He was leaning against the cage. He was holding his side. Overeem walked in for the kill and threw a knee. Brown caught it and threw a front kick that connected flush on Overeem's chin. Overeem dropped. Brown swarmed with elbows and the fight was over. 20 seconds earlier, Brown could barely move. Then Overeem got greedy. Then Overeem was unconscious. The lesson is the same as it always is at heavyweight. The fight is never over until somebody is unconscious. Brown understood that better than anyone on that night. Robbie Lawler. Robbie Lawler was bleeding everywhere. Rory MacDonald had broken his nose in the first round of their welterweight title rematch at UFC 189 in July 2015. Then MacDonald started pulling ahead on the scorecards. By the end of the 4th round, MacDonald was winning the fight, and Lawler's face was a horror movie. Blood was running down his chest, his nose was crooked, his lip was split open. The fight was supposed to be over because nobody fights through that much damage and wins. Then between the 4th and 5th rounds, the camera caught the moment that defined the fight. Lawler stared across the cage at MacDonald. MacDonald stared back. They both stood there bleeding and exhausted and refusing to look away. The 5th round started. Lawler walked forward. He landed a straight left that broke MacDonald's nose worse than his own. MacDonald collapsed face first. The fight ended. Lawler kept the title. The image of those two men staring at each other between rounds is one of the most iconic in UFC history because it told you what was about to happen before it happened. Lawler was not going to lose. He decided that before the round started. Diego Sanchez was losing to Clay Guida for the first round and a half of their fight at the Ultimate Fighter 9 finale in June 2009. Guida was taking him down. Guida was controlling him. Guida was out-wrestling him in a fight that Sanchez was supposed to win on his feet. Then halfway through the second round, Sanchez landed a right uppercut on the chin that dropped Guida flat. Guida hit the canvas hard. Sanchez should have finished him. He swarmed with strikes, but Guida survived. Then Guida came back, and the fight became one of the most violent 3-round wars the UFC had ever seen. Sanchez won by split decision. The uppercut is the moment everyone remembers. One punch turned a fight he was losing into the fight that won Fight of the Year. Sanchez built a Hall of Fame career on moments like that. He was never the most skilled fighter in any matchup. He was always the one who would not stop coming forward and always the one who could find one shot to change everything. Anthony Pettis. Anthony Pettis was getting controlled by Charles Oliveira on the ground at UFC on Fox 21 in August 2016. Oliveira is one of the best grapplers in lightweight history. He had Pettis in a guillotine choke that looked tight enough to finish him. Pettis was turning red. His eyes were closing. Then Pettis spun out of the choke into top position, and Oliveira immediately went for an armbar. Pettis defended. Oliveira transitioned to a triangle. Pettis defended again. Oliveira locked up another guillotine. Pettis spun out again. 3 submission attempts in less than 2 minutes. Then Pettis caught Oliveira in a guillotine of his own and squeezed. Oliveira tapped at 1 minute and 49 seconds of the second round. The fight was a grappling exchange where Pettis was losing every single position until the moment he was winning the fight. That is what makes it a comeback. Pettis was almost finished 3 different ways. He still walked out with the submission win. Oliveira would go on to become a UFC champion and one of the most dangerous submission artists the lightweight division has ever seen. Pettis caught him on a night where survival turned into victory. Justin Gaethje was losing to Michael Johnson for the entire first round at UFC on Fox 26 in July 2017. Johnson was faster. Johnson was sharper. Johnson was hitting Gaethje with combinations that would have stopped most fighters. Gaethje was eating shots and absorbing punishment in his UFC debut against an opponent everyone thought he was not ready for. By the end of the first round, Gaethje's face was already swelling. His nose was busted. His mouth was open. He looked finished. Then he came out for round 2 and the fight changed forward. Johnson started slowing down. Halfway through the second round, Gaethje caught Johnson with a knee that crumpled him. Then he finished him with strikes on the ground. Performance of the night. Fight of the night, the kind of debut that announces a star. Gaethje absorbed more damage in 15 minutes than most fighters absorb in their entire career. He came back from a one-sided first round to finish a top 10 lightweight in his first UFC fight. That is what put him on the map. Donald Cerrone. Donald Cerrone was getting outboxed by Yancy Medeiros in the first round at UFC Fight Night in February 2018. Medeiros had the power. Medeiros had the timing. Medeiros dropped Cerrone with a clean punch, and the fight looked like it was about to end early. Cerrone got up. Medeiros walked in to finish him. Cerrone caught him with a counter that turned the fight around in one exchange. By the end of the first round, Cerrone was the one walking forward, and Medeiros was the one bleeding. Cerrone finished him by TKO. In the first round of a fight he had been losing 2 minutes earlier. That kind of comeback was the entire Cerrone career in one fight. He was never the safest fighter. He was never the most cautious fighter. He was the guy who would get hit, get dropped, and then find a way to finish you anyway because he had the experience and the toughness to survive moments most fighters do not survive. Cowboy lost a lot of fights because of how he fought. He also won a lot of fights for the exact same reason. Israel Adesanya. Israel Adesanya was losing to Kelvin Gastelum at UFC 236 in April 2019 in a fight for the interim middleweight championship. Gastelum dropped him in the second round with a clean left hand. Then Gastelum dropped him again. Adesanya was bleeding from cuts above and below both eyes. His face was swelling. He was behind on the scorecards going into the 5th round. He needed a finish or a dominant round to win the title. He delivered both. The 5th round was one of the greatest title fight rounds in UFC history. Adesanya started landing combinations that broke Gastelum down. He hurt him with a knee. He dropped him with a punch. Gastelum survived but barely. Adesanya won the round so decisively that he won the fight on the scorecards. Interim middleweight champion. The man who was getting outpointed and outlanded for 4 rounds turned the fight around in 5 minutes because he refused to lose. Adesanya would go on to unify the title and reign over the middleweight division for years. years. The Gastelum fight is the one that made it possible. He won that title with 1 round of perfect striking after 20 minutes of getting beaten up. Conor McGregor. Conor McGregor was losing to Nate Diaz for almost the entire first round of their rematch at UFC 202 in August 2016. Diaz was applying the same pressure that had finished McGregor 5 months earlier. He was eating McGregor's shots and walking forward. McGregor was already breathing hard. The first fight was about to repeat itself. Then McGregor changed the strategy. He started chopping Diaz's lead leg with kicks. He started moving laterally instead of standing in the pocket. He started picking his shots. Diaz kept walking forward, but his legs were getting destroyed. By the 3rd round, Diaz was hurting. By the 4th, McGregor was firing combinations and getting out before Diaz could counter. McGregor won by majority decision. It is a comeback because it was a comeback inside a career. McGregor had been finished by Diaz 5 months earlier and was on the verge of being finished again in the first round. He adjusted in real time and won a 5-round war against the man who had broken him. That fight did 1.6 million pay-per-view buys and stands as one of the greatest fights in UFC history. McGregor lost the first round and won the war. Leon Edwards. Leon Edwards was losing the welterweight title fight to Kamaru Usman at UFC 278 in August 2022. He had won the first round on most scorecards, but Usman dominated rounds 2, 3, and 4 with wrestling. Edwards could not stop the takedowns. He could not generate offense from his back. By the start of the 5th round, Edwards was behind on every scorecard and needed a finish. There were 56 seconds left in the fight. Edwards faked a body kick and threw a left high kick that connected flush on Usman's jaw. Usman went rigid. His arms locked. He fell backwards like he had been unplugged. Edwards landed one more punch on the ground, and the referee jumped in. Leon Edwards was the welterweight champion. He had been losing for 24 minutes. He won the fight in the final 56 seconds with one kick. There has never been a comeback like it in UFC championship history. Not the timing, not the stakes, not the way Usman went out. Edwards beat the man who had beaten him 7 years earlier. He beat one of the most dominant champions in welterweight history. He did it with the last meaningful exchange of a fight he was about to lose. Some comebacks happen in the middle of a fight. The greatest ones happen with seconds left. Leon Edwards has the greatest one of all, Max Holloway. Max Holloway was tied with Justin Gaethje on the scorecards heading into the final round of their BMF title fight at UFC 300 in April 2024. Both men had given everything for 20 minutes. Holloway had used volume and footwork. Gaethje had used leg kicks and power. The fight could go either way. With 10 seconds left in the 5th round, Holloway pointed at the ground in the middle of the cage. He was telling Gaethje to stand and trade. Two of the toughest fighters in UFC history walked to the center and started swinging. Holloway threw a right hand that landed flush. Gaethje fell face first. He was unconscious before he hit the canvas. The fight ended with 1 second left. The arena erupted. The knockout is the most replayed moment in UFC history because it was not just a finish. It was a finish that did not need to happen. Holloway was tied on the scorecards. He could have coasted. He could have run out the clock and won the BMF title on points. Instead, he pointed at the center of the cage and asked for a war he did not need. He won the war. He won the title. He gave the sport one of the greatest moments it has ever seen. That is what makes it the craziest comeback on this list. The fight was even. It was about to end. Holloway turned the final 10 seconds into a knockout that nobody who watched it will ever forget. Level 1. Level 1 is Demetrius Johnson. Mighty Mouse is the cleanest example of a fighter with zero psycho in him. He is calm, he is polite, he is humble. He has never trash-talked an opponent in any meaningful way across his entire career. He shows up, he fights, he wins, he goes home. That is it. Demetrius Johnson holds the record for the longest title reign in UFC history at 2,294 days. He defended the flyweight belt 11 consecutive times, which is the record for a single weight class. He is widely considered one of the greatest mixed martial artists who has ever lived, and he did all of it without ever once trying to convince anyone he was scary. He streamed video games in his spare time. He did interviews where he talked about being a normal dad. He never picked fights at press conferences. He never threw chairs. He never tried to look unhinged. He just fought, and he fought better than almost anyone in the history of the sport. There is no edge to him. There is no menace. There is no aura of someone who might do something crazy. He is just a guy who happens to be one of the most technically gifted fighters MMA has ever produced. That is level 1, the complete absence of psycho. A fighter so balanced and so normal that the only intimidating thing about him is the skill set. Level 2. Level 2 is Robert Whittaker. Whittaker has psycho hidden underneath the surface, but it almost never comes out. He is a former UFC middleweight champion. He has fought every elite middleweight of his era. He has been in 5-round wars with Yoel Romero, Israel Adesanya, and Kelvin Gastelum. And in every single press conference, every stare down, every interview, he has been calm and respectful. He thanks his opponents. He praises them. He smiles. He is the kind of fighter who walks into the cage looking like he is about to apologize to the man across from him before he tries to knock his head off. But there is a switch. When the cage closes, Whittaker fights with controlled aggression that has finished some of the toughest middleweights ever. He knocked out Jakar Souza, who had not been finished by strikes in his career until that moment. He knocked out Darren Till. The psycho is there. It just lives in the fighting. Outside the cage, he is a husband and a father, and a guy who would rather be at home with his kids than in front of a camera. That is level 2, the kind of fighter who has the violence in him, but keeps it locked away until the bell rings. Level 3. Level 3 is Khabib Nurmagomedov. Khabib was never a trash talker in the traditional sense. He was not loud, he was not theatrical. He did not throw water bottles or scream at journalists. But there was always something underneath, a quiet certainty that he was going to hurt you. He famously told Conor McGregor at their face-off that he was going to smash him. He did. He told Dustin Poirier he respected him, but the smash was coming. It came. He held 29-0 across his entire career and retired undefeated as the UFC lightweight champion. The psycho in Khabib was not the surface kind. It was the kind that came out when someone disrespected his family, his religion, or his team. After he submitted Conor McGregor at UFC 229, he climbed the cage and dove into the crowd to attack Dylan Dennis, McGregor's training partner. That moment told you everything. Khabib looked composed for 25 minutes inside the cage, and then, the second he saw the man who had been talking about his father and his religion for months, he went over the fence. There was no hesitation. He did not care about the consequences. He did not care about the 10-point fine or the suspension. The mauling came out, and you saw what had been sitting under the comm the whole time. That is level 3, the kind of psycho that hides in plain sight until something pulls the trigger. Level 4. Level 4 is Conor McGregor. McGregor is the most calculated psycho in UFC history. Everything he did was theater. The trash talk was scripted. The press conference walkouts were scripted. The bottle throwing at Khabib was scripted. He was not actually losing his mind, he was building a brand. But underneath the act, there was something real. McGregor had a temper that he could not always control. He attacked a bus full of fighters at the Barclays Center in April 2018 to get to Khabib, throwing a metal dolly through the window and injuring multiple people. That was not a press conference stunt. That was a man who had lost it. He pleaded guilty to disorderly conduct. He was charged with assault in Ireland over an incident at a pub where he punched a man in the face for refusing to drink his whiskey. He has been involved in multiple legal incidents outside of fighting that are not part of any promotional routine. The line between the act and the real person became very thin over the years. He is 22-6 as a fighter and was the first simultaneous 2-division champion in UFC history. He has not won a fight since January 2020. The psycho that built his career is the same psycho that is slowly dismantling his life now. That is level 4, the kind of psycho that started as a marketing tool and became real. Level 5. Level 5 is Sean Strickland. Strickland is openly unwell and he does not hide it. He has spoken in detail about the abuse he suffered as a child. He has talked about wanting to die. He has said in interviews that fighting is the only thing keeping him alive. Most fighters keep that kind of thing private. Strickland puts it on his Instagram story. He says things at press conferences that get him in trouble. He has feuded with virtually every other UFC fighter at some point. He has called out journalists, politicians, other champions, training partners, and random people on the internet. He is permanently online and permanently angry. And yet, underneath all of it, Strickland is one of the most disciplined fighters in the UFC. He trains constantly. He does not drink. He does not party. He sleeps in a small house and lives like a soldier. He won the UFC middleweight championship at UFC 293 by completely shutting down Israel Adesanya across 5 rounds, winning 4 of the 5 rounds in one of the biggest upsets in middleweight history. The psycho in Strickland is not an act. He is a damaged man who has built his entire identity around being a fighter because he does not know how to be anything else. That is level 5, the kind of psycho where you cannot tell anymore where the fighter ends and the trauma begins. Level 6. Level 6 is Diego Sanchez. Diego Sanchez crossed the line from intense fighter into something else entirely in the final years of his career. He won the Ultimate Fighter Season 1 in 2005 and fought in the UFC for 16 years across 4 weight classes. His yes cartwheel entrance became iconic. His fights against Clay Guida, Caro Parisian, and Gilbert Melendez are still considered some of the most violent and emotional bouts the UFC has ever put on. He fought with a level of intensity that made him a fan favorite for over a decade. But somewhere along the way, the intensity became something darker. He started talking about energy, about spirits, about fighting being a religious calling. He started working with a man named Joshua Fabia, who had no coaching credentials and ran a self-defense school in Albuquerque. Fabia had Sanchez stand still while he threw slaps at his face on camera. Sanchez stopped showing up to training with his actual coaches. He cut ties with Greg Jackson and the team that had built his career. Videos surfaced of Sanchez doing bizarre warm-ups and giving interviews where he sounded completely disconnected from reality. The UFC released him in 2021, citing concerns about Fabia's influence on his life and his medical clearances. By the end, Diego Sanchez was no longer a fighter. He was a man who had been broken by a sport that took everything from him and replaced it with something nobody outside of his inner circle could understand. That is level 6. The kind of psycho that comes from spending too long in a sport that is not built for the people who give themselves to it completely. Level 7. Level 7 is Jon Koppenhaver, War Machine. He fought twice in the UFC in 2007 under his birth name before legally changing it to War Machine in 2008. He went 1-1 in the promotion and was released. He continued fighting in Bellator and on regional shows for years. The signs were there for anyone paying attention. He had a blog where he wrote about violent fantasies. He posted on social media about wanting to hurt people. He had multiple arrests for bar fights and assaults across his career. He served prison time for an assault in San Diego in 2010. The MMA community treated him as a sideshow, a guy with the stupid name and a bad attitude who could occasionally win a fight. Then on August 8, 2014, he broke into the home of his ex-girlfriend Christy Mack in Las Vegas. Her friend Corey Thomas was there. Koppenhaver beat Thomas unconscious and then turned on Mack. He beat her for nearly 2 hours. She suffered 18 broken bones, a ruptured liver, a lacerated kidney, and lost several teeth. She required extensive reconstructive surgery to rebuild her face. Koppenhaver fled and was a fugitive for 10 days before being apprehended at a hotel in Simi Valley, California. In March 2017, he was found guilty on 29 of 34 charges, including sexual assault, kidnapping, and coercion. He was sentenced to 36 years to life in prison. He will be eligible for parole in 2050 at the earliest. He is the worst person who has ever competed in the UFC. There is no comparison. There is no one close. Every other name on this list is a fighter who is intense, damaged, theatrical, or unwell. War Machine is a convicted abuser who almost killed a woman and is going to die in prison. That is level 7, the end of the scale. The line that nobody else in the history of this sport has come close to crossing. The reminder that sometimes when a fighter calls himself a psycho, you should believe him the first time. Outfighter. Outfighters base their style on range, timing, and clean distance striking. The goal is to hit opponents from the outside while staying just far enough away to avoid counters, level changes, or clinch entries. Rather than forcing messy exchanges, outfighters use jabs, straight punches, calf kicks, and lateral movement to keep the fight at their preferred range. The style depends on footwork, awareness, and discipline, because once an opponent closes distance, the outfighter's biggest biggest advantage starts to shrink. Israel Adesanya is one of the clearest modern examples. He manages distance with feints, long straight shots, and constant reads on his opponent's reactions. Rather than rushing combinations, he often wins by making the other fighter overreach, then punishing them with precise counters or intercepting strikes. His ability to control where the fight takes place is what defines the Ma outfighter. Leon Edwards shows a more measured version of the same style. He works behind a long jab, clean kicks, and disciplined footwork, rarely giving opponents easy entries. Edwards does not need huge volume to control a fight. He uses distance and accuracy to keep exchanges on his terms, which is exactly what the best outfighters do. Pressure fighter. Pressure fighters win by steadily advancing, backing opponents toward the fence, and forcing them to make decisions under constant stress. Unlike reckless brawlers, true pressure fighters do not simply charge forward. They close space with structure, cutting angles, limiting exits, and forcing opponents to fight while moving backward. The style is built on pace, patience, and the ability to keep the opponent uncomfortable minute after minute. Merab Dvalishvili is a modern example of relentless pressure in MMA. He floods opponents with movement, level changes, chain wrestling threats, and non-stop activity. Even when he is not landing big damage, he creates panic and fatigue by never allowing the other fighter to settle. His style works because the pressure itself becomes the weapon. Max Holloway also shows pressure in a striking heavy form. He walks opponents down behind volume, layered combinations, and constant reads. Holloway does not always need one-shot power. He wins by making opponents defend for too long, then drowning them in pace once their reactions slow. Counter-striker. Counter-strikers build their game around timing, patience, and punishment. Instead of leading every exchange, they wait for opponents to commit first, then answer with sharper, cleaner, and often more damaging shots. This style requires composure and elite reads, because the counter-striker must understand when the opponent is vulnerable and be ready to fire at exactly the right moment. Alex Pereira is one of the most dangerous modern examples. He does not waste movement or throw for the sake of activity. He waits for mistakes, especially predictable entries and defensive lapses, then lands brutal left hooks, knees, or straight counters. What makes Pereira so dangerous is that every overextension against him can end the fight instantly. Conor McGregor at his peak showed the same style from a different rhythm. He used distance, feints, and stance control to lure opponents into open lanes, then punished them with straight left hands and sharp pull counters. His best performances came when opponents felt forced to attack first and walked directly into his timing. Wrestle boxer. Wrestle boxers blend clean boxing with proactive wrestling to create layered offense. Their striking gives them a way to win at range, but the real power of the style is how boxing and takedown threats feed each other. Opponents must respect punches, which opens entries for level changes. Then once takedowns become a threat, they become hesitant on the feet. That constant uncertainty is what makes the style so effective. Georges St. Pierre is one of the greatest examples in MMA history. His jab and footwork forced opponents to think about striking first, but that attention made his takedowns even harder to stop. Gespa did not just mix skills randomly. He made each layer strengthen the next, which is why his game felt complete against almost everyone. Bilal Muhammad shows a more modern version of the same approach. He works behind steady boxing, smart pressure, and timely takedowns, rarely giving opponents a clean read on what is coming next. His style is not built on chaos. It is built on making opponents constantly wrong. Control grappler. Control grapplers win through positional dominance, top pressure, and consistency. Their main objective is not always instant damage or quick submissions. It is to put the opponent underneath them, keep them there, drain their gas tank, and slowly break their ability to escape. The style depends on balance, mat awareness, and the patience to hold good positions instead of chasing reckless finishes. Khabib Nurmagomedov is the clearest modern example. He pushed opponents to the fence, forced scrambles, and trapped them under overwhelming top pressure. Once he established position, he made every second miserable. Opponents were not just losing rounds. They were being mentally and physically exhausted by a style built around total control. Islam Makhachev represents a more polished modern evolution of the same idea. He combines takedown threats, cage work, positional control, and submission awareness into one seamless system. Makhachev does not simply take people down. He takes them down into positions where everything gets worse from there. Submission hunter. Submission Submission hunters are always looking to finish the fight once it hits the mat. While control grapplers often prioritize position first, submission hunters constantly search for necks, limbs, and transitions. Their style thrives in chaos, because the more movement and scrambling there is, the more chances they get to catch something sudden. Charles Oliveira is the best modern example. He is dangerous in almost every ground sequence because he welcomes scrambles that other fighters fear. Give him a neck, an arm, or even a short moment of disorder, and he can turn it into a choke or joint lock immediately. What makes Oliveira special is not just submission skill. It is how quickly he turns offense out of unstable positions. Brian Ortega also fits this archetype. Even when losing portions of fights, he remains a submission threat the second an opponent overcommits. Ortega shows how a submission hunter can stay dangerous even when the broader fight is not fully in their favor. Kick-heavy striker. Kick-heavy strikers use range weapons, body attacks, and layered kicking games to control distance and damage opponents without relying only on boxing. The style revolves around calf kicks, body kicks, teeps, question mark kicks, and head kick threats that force constant defensive adjustments. A great kick-heavy striker makes opponents hesitate to step, punch, or shoot because every entry feels punishable. Edson Barboza is one of the purest examples. His kicking arsenal has always been his core identity, especially his devastating leg and body kicks. Barboza can change the shape of a fight by destroying movement first, then opening up bigger shots once the opponent slows down. Yair Rodriguez shows the more creative version of this style. He attacks from unusual angles, throws a wide variety of kicks, and keeps opponents guessing about where the next strike is coming from. His unpredictability is what gives the kick-heavy style its most dangerous form. Clinch specialist. Clinch specialists do some of their best work in the space where many fighters just try to stall. They use underhooks, collar ties, wrist control, knees, elbows, trips, and cage positioning to turn close-range contact into offense. Instead of seeing the clinch as a pause, they use it as a place to control posture, land damage, and break rhythm. Jose Aldo showed how devastating clinch work can be when mixed with smart defense and fast exits. He used body attacks, short punches, and strong positioning to make inside exchanges expensive. Aldo did not waste clinch moments. He won them. Valentina Shevchenko has also used clinch fighting at a very high level, especially with knees, trips, and tight positional control. She shows how clinch specialists can dominate without always needing wild volume, because every small exchange is technically sharp and efficient. Cage wrestler. Cage wrestlers specialize in using the fence as an extra tool. They press opponents backward, lock their hips in place, attack singles and doubles along the cage, and chain attempts together until the opponent finally breaks. Even when they do not land the first takedown, they keep the other fighter pinned and working, which drains energy and strips away confidence. Kamaru Usman at his peak was one of the best examples. He used the cage to trap opponents, then mixed bodywork, control, and takedown pressure in ways that made it difficult to ever reset. His opponents were often fighting the fence as much as they were fighting him. Jailton Almeida also shows how powerful cage-based wrestling can be in modern MMA. Once he gets opponents to the fence and starts connecting attempts, the whole sequence begins to snowball. That is the essence of a true cage wrestler. Scrambler. Scramblers thrive in transitions. Instead of accepting positions, they constantly invert, Granby, switch hips, stand up, re-attack, and force both fighters into unstable moments. Their strength is not always in holding one position forever. It is in winning the chaos between positions. Scramblers are difficult to control because they make every exchange feel unfinished. Tony Ferguson at his best embodied this style. He could turn bad positions into front chokes, elbows, stand-ups, or completely new scrambles in seconds. Fighting him meant never feeling safe, even when you seem to have the sequence under control. Beneil Dariush also shows how dangerous a skilled scrambler can be. He is comfortable in transitions that many fighters find risky, and he often turns defensive moments into attacking opportunities. That ability to operate in the blur between positions is what defines the scrambler. Point fighter. Point fighters win through discipline, efficiency, and round management. They do not chase every exchange or force unnecessary risks. Instead, they focus on landing first, managing distance, stealing key moments, and minimizing damage against them. The style can frustrate viewers who want chaos, but it is highly effective because it treats the fight like a long problem to solve rather than a brawl to survive. Sean Strickland often fights this way with his jab-heavy, defensively responsible style. He controls range, touches opponents repeatedly, and keeps exchanges in the kind of rhythm he prefers. He is not always trying to overwhelm. He is trying to outscore and outposition. Alexa Grasso has also shown many point fighting qualities in her calmer, calmer, cleaner performances. She works with control, picks better shots, and stays composed rather than giving opponents wild openings. That is how point fighters quietly take rounds away. Brawler. Brawlers are built for chaos. They are comfortable in messy exchanges, willing to trade, and often trust durability and offense more than clean defense. Their success comes from making fights wild enough that structure starts to break down. Once that happens, they back themselves to hit harder, stay tougher, or keep throwing when others would slow down. Justin Gaethje is the perfect modern example. Even as he became more measured, his core identity still came from brutal leg kicks, heavy hands, and a willingness to force violent exchanges. He wins by making opponents operate in a storm they are not comfortable in. Dustin Poirier represents the more layered version of a brawler. He can box cleanly, but he is at his most dangerous when fights get heated and he starts exchanging with conviction. Poirier shows that brawlers are not necessarily reckless. The best ones know exactly when to turn the fight into fire. Switch stance technician. Switch stance technicians use stance changes as a real tactical weapon, not just something flashy. They move between orthodox and southpaw to change angles, open new strike lines, shut down an opponent's best weapons, and constantly force fresh reads. This style requires deep comfort in both stances, because fake switching is useless if one side is clearly weaker. TJ Dillashaw showed this style at a very high level. He blended movement, footwork, feints, and stance shifts into a game that constantly forced opponents to hesitate. Every switch changed the geometry of the fight, which made his offense harder to predict. Demetrius Johnson also demonstrated how complete this style can look in MMA. He switched stances fluidly without losing position, balance, or defensive responsibility. That is what separates a true switch stance technician from a fighter who only changes stance for show. Ma styles are rarely pure. Most elite fighters borrow from multiple archetypes depending on the matchup, the phase of the fight, and the skills in front of them. But these 12 styles give you the clearest framework for understanding what you are actually watching. Once you can recognize the style battle underneath the action, every fight becomes easier to read. Rehydration. The fight is not won in the cage, it is won on the scale the day before. A fighter who walks around at 185 and drains himself down to 155 is not a lightweight. He is a middleweight pretending to be a lightweight for 24 hours. He cuts the water out of his body, steps on the scale at the limit, and then puts every pound back on before the fight starts. That is rehydration, and it is the single biggest unfair advantage in modern MMA. Some fighters rehydrate 10 pounds, some rehydrate 20, some rehydrate close to 30. Dustin Poirier walks around in the high 180s and fights at 155. Conor McGregor used to rehydrate to nearly 170 for lightweight bouts. Khabib Nurmagomedov was a natural welterweight who fought at lightweight his entire career. The fighter who cuts the most weight wins the size battle before a single punch is thrown. The smaller man on fight night is not the smaller man on paper. He is the man whose body could not handle the cut. The whole sport runs on this and pretends it does not. That is the advantage. The scale is a lie and everyone is in on it. Timing the cut. Cutting weight is one thing. Cutting weight at the right time is another. Some fighters know exactly when to take a fight and exactly when to turn one down. They wait for the champion to be coming off an injury. They wait for the contender to be coming off a war. They wait until the matchup is already tilted before they sign the contract. That is timing. And timing wins fights before the cage door closes. Look at how Sean Strickland got his title shot. Dricus du Plessis pulled out and Strickland was the next name available against an Adesanya who had already fought 5 times in 2 years. Look at how Leon Edwards got the rematch with Usman after years of inactivity from the champion. Look at how Islam Makhachev fought for the vacant title instead of beating the man who held it. The right opponent at the right moment is worth more than any skill. Some fighters spend their careers chasing fights they should not take. Other fighters wait, stay quiet, and step in when the door is already open. That is the advantage. Knowing when to fight is half the sport. Natural size. Some fighters are not cutting weight, they are filling the limit. There's a difference between a man who walks around at 165 and fights at 155, and a man who walks around at 145 and fights at 155. Both are lightweights on fight night. Only one of them is actually small. The natural size advantage is the cleanest unfair edge in MMA because nobody can train for it. You cannot lift your way into longer arms. You cannot not stretch your way into a bigger frame. Jon Jones has the longest reach in UFC history at 84.5 inches. He fought at light heavyweight for 15 years against men who were giving up 6 inches of reach every night. Alex Pereira moved up to light heavyweight and hit men who had never been hit by a middleweight that big. Khamzat Chimaev walks into welterweight and middleweight bouts looking like he eats his opponents for breakfast. Size on fight night beats size on paper every single time. The man with the longer arms hits you first. The man with the wider frame controls you in the clinch. The man with the bigger bones takes the shot and gives one back. That is the advantage. Genetics does the work, the gym never could. Trash talk. Trash talk is not just promotion. It is a weapon. A fighter who can get inside the other man's head wins rounds before the bell rings. He makes the other guy emotional. He makes him fight angry. He makes him abandon the game plan in the first 30 seconds because he is trying to prove something instead of trying to win. Conor McGregor built an entire career on it. He did not just hype his fights, he broke his opponents. Jose Aldo charged across the octagon at UFC 194 because McGregor had spent 6 months telling him he was a coward. Aldo got knocked out in 13 seconds. Chael Sonnen made a career out of fighting above his level by getting under the skin of better fighters. Colby Covington has done the same. The trash talker forces the other man to fight with his ego, and ego loses fights. The advantage is that the talker is calm and the listener is angry. The talker has been planning this for months. The listener is reacting in real time. By the time the cage door closes, one man is already losing. Bone density. You cannot see it on tape. You cannot measure it in the gym, but it shows up the moment a clean shot lands. Some fighters have skulls and jaws that do not break. Some fighters have shins that wreck legs and never bruise. That is bone density. It is the advantage that explains why Mark Hunt walked through punches that should have killed him. It is the advantage that explains why Mirko Krokop's left high kick separated men from consciousness. It is the advantage that explains why Nate Diaz has been hit by some of the hardest punchers in lightweight history and never been knocked out cold once. Genetics builds the chin. Training does not. You can condition your neck. You can strengthen your jaw muscles. You cannot make your bones thicker than they already are. The fighter with the heavy bones is fighting a different sport. He hits harder without trying and absorbs more without flinching. The advantage is that the body itself is the weapon. Everything else is just decoration, plot armor. Some fighters get treated differently by the UFC. The matchups break their way. The judges find rounds for them. The promotion protects them when their stock is high and feeds them when it is not. That is plot armor, and it is one of the most obvious unfair advantages in the sport. Look at how Sean O'Malley climbed the bantamweight rankings. He was given a fight with Peter Yan and got the decision in a bout most analysts thought he lost. Look at how Paddy Pimblett kept getting matched with opponents who were perfect stylistic gifts until he ran into Tony Ferguson on a losing streak. Look at how Conor McGregor got an immediate title shot at lightweight without ever winning a fight in the division. The promotion picks favorites. The judges score for the favorites. The cards are built around the favorites. A fighter without plot armor has to win clean every single time. A fighter with plot armor can lose rounds and still get the nod. The advantage is that the sport is not actually fair. The names that sell tickets get the close calls. The names that do not sell tickets get cut. PED use. Steroids work. They have always worked. They will always work. The fighter on testosterone recovers faster than the fighter who is clean. He trains harder. He takes more rounds in the gym. He builds more muscle. He cuts weight better. He hits harder. He pushes a pace the natural fighter cannot match. The UFC has caught fighters before. Anderson Silva failed for Drostanolone before his rematch with Chris Weidman. Jon Jones tested positive for Turinabol before his second fight with Daniel Cormier, and the result was overturned. Brock Lesnar failed for Clomiphene before fighting Mark Hunt. Vitor Belfort spent half his career on testosterone replacement therapy and looked like a different species when he was using it. The fighters who got caught are not the only ones who used. They are just the ones who got caught. PED use is the advantage that makes everything else easier. Stronger muscles, faster recovery, bigger weight cuts, more cardio, more damage absorbed. The clean fighter is fighting up a level every time he steps in with someone who is not. That is the advantage. The sport tests for it and still cannot keep up with it. Referees. The referee decides when the fight ends. That is more power than most most fans realize. A referee who lets a fight go too long can change a career. A referee who stops a fight too early can end one. Some referees are known for letting fighters take extra punishment. Some are known for jumping in early. Mario Yamasaki was criticized for years for late stoppages. Herb Dean has been criticized for both late and early stoppages depending on the fight. The fighter who knows the referee is going to give him another 30 seconds to recover gets 30 seconds to recover. The fighter who draws a quick trigger ref does not. Add in the cage grabs that go unpunished. The eye pokes that get warnings instead of point deductions. The fence holds that prevent takedowns. The decisions on whether a fighter is grounded. Every one of those calls tilts the fight. The referee is not in the cage, but the referee is in every exchange. The advantage is that some fighters get treated like champions before they are champions. Other fighters do not. And the man in the third lane controls more of the result than anyone wants to admit. Southpaws. Roughly 10% of the population is left-handed. In MMA, the number is far higher. That is not a coincidence. The southpaw stance is an unfair advantage built into the sport at the structural level. Most fighters train against orthodox opponents because most opponents are orthodox. When they meet a southpaw, the timing is wrong, the angles are wrong. The lead foot is in the wrong place. The jab is coming from the other side. The power hand is loaded from a position they have not drilled enough. Conor McGregor built his entire career on the southpaw left hand because orthodox fighters could not figure out where it was coming from. Anderson Silva used the southpaw stance to set up some of the greatest counters in MMA history. Robbie Lawler, Lyoto Machida, Cody Garbrandt, Dustin Poirier. The southpaw advantage is so consistent that fighters who grew up orthodox sometimes switch to southpaw on purpose because they know what it does to the other man's training. The advantage is that the southpaw has trained against orthodox his whole life. The orthodox has only trained against southpaws sometimes. One man knows the matchup, the other man is figuring it out in real time. That is 9 unfair advantages in MMA. Some you can train against, some you can adapt to, and some are decided long before either fighter walks to the cage. Level 1. Level 1 is Demetrius Johnson. Mighty Mouse is the greatest flyweight of all time and one of the most decorated champions in UFC history. He defended the flyweight title 11 consecutive times. That is the record for most consecutive title defenses at a single weight class. He beat every contender the division produced. Joseph Benavidez twice, John Dodson twice, Henry Cejudo, Kyoji Horiguchi, Tim Elliott, Ray Borg in the fight where he pulled off the first ever suplex to armbar in UFC history. He was so dominant that the UFC eventually traded him to one championship because they could not sell pay-per-views with him on top of the card. And the reason they could not sell pay-per-views is the reason he is level 1. DJ does not talk. He never has. He shows up, he fights, he wins, he goes home. He has never insulted an opponent. He has never tried to manufacture a feud. He has never said anything controversial in a press conference. His interviews are about technique and game planning and respecting his opponent. That is it. The man held a UFC title for 6 years and never said a single quotable line. Most fans would not be able to tell you what his voice sounds like. He is one of the greatest fighters who has ever lived and he has zero trash talk. That is level 1. Pure silence. The opposite of marketing. The fighter who lets the record do everything for him. Level 2. Level 2 is Islam Makhachev. Islam is the current UFC welterweight champion and one of the most dominant fighters on the planet. His record is 28-1, and his only loss came in his second professional fight back in 2015. He has not lost a round in years. He destroyed Charles Oliveira to win the lightweight title. He beat Alexander Volkanovski twice. He submitted Dustin Poirier with a dark choke. He moved up to welterweight and took the belt from Jack Della Maddalena at UFC 322. And in every press conference for every one of those fights, he barely said a word. Islam talks like a fighter who learned English specifically to answer questions about training camp. His responses are short. His tone is flat. He does not insult anyone. He does not call anyone out. When other fighters try to bait him, he stares at them like they are wasting his time. He occasionally smiles. He occasionally laughs. But there is no trash talk. There is no manufactured beef. He represents the Dagestani approach that Khabib built. You fight, you win, you go back to the mountains. The American Kickboxing Academy turned that into a brand. Quiet, dominant, unbothered. Islam took it further than anyone. He is the pound-for-pound #1 fighter in the world, and you could probably count his quotable lines on one hand. That is level 2. Slightly more visible than DJ, still completely silent. Level 3. Level 3 is Khabib Nurmagomedov. Khabib retired undefeated at 29-0 as the longest reigning UFC lightweight champion in history. He defended the belt 3 times before walking away. He beat Conor McGregor, he beat Dustin Poirier, he beat Justin Gaethje, he beat every elite lightweight he ever faced, and he did not lose a single round in a championship fight. And for most of his career, he barely said anything at all. Pre-McGregor Khabib was the same fighter as Islam. Quiet, polite, boring on the microphone by Western standards. He answered questions in broken English and went back to his hotel room. But the McGregor situation cracked something open. After the bus attack in April 2018, where McGregor threw a hand truck through a window and hurt other fighters, Khabib stopped pretending to be calm about it. He started talking. He called McGregor a chicken. He called him a clown. He famously said, "I will smash your boy," to Conor's face. After the UFC 229 fight, he jumped over the cage to attack Conor's teammate. That was not the behavior of a man who had no trash talk in him. It was the behavior of a man who had been holding it back for a decade. Outside of the McGregor feud, Khabib was almost as quiet as Islam. He could destroy you with a single line. That is level 3. Mostly silent, capable of devastating you when provoked. The kind of trash talk that hits harder because it almost never happens. Level 4. Level 4 is Alexander Volkanovski. Volk is one of the greatest featherweights of all time. 2-time UFC featherweight champion. 28 wins. 3 Max Holloway victories. Wins over Brian Ortega, the Korean Zombie, Yair Rodriguez, and Diego Lopez. He has been at the top of the division for the better part of a decade, and Volk talks. He is not silent like Islam. He is not vicious like McGregor. He is somewhere in between. He has confidence in every interview. He breaks down opponents with technical analysis and calls out flaws in their game. He will tell you exactly why he is going to win and exactly how. He will engage in face-offs. He will have back and forth on social media. He talked plenty of trash to Topuria before their first fight at UFC 298. He talked plenty to Diego Lopes before UFC 325. But there is a ceiling on it. He never gets personal. He never goes after family. He never crosses the line into hatred. His trash talk is measured. He is selling the fight, not destroying the opponent. He is the Australian version of confident. Self-assured without being cruel. That is level 4. Real trash talk that actually moves the needle. Stops well short of nasty. Level 5. Level 5 is Sean Strickland. Strickland is the former UFC middleweight champion. He beat Israel Adesanya at UFC 293 in one of the biggest upsets of the modern era. He has fought everyone the division has ever produced, and he is one of the most quotable fighters in UFC history because he says things no other fighter would ever say. Strickland does not have a filter. He insults journalists in press conferences. He insults teammates. He insults his own coaches sometimes. He has been suspended by the UFC for things he has said on streams. He has gotten into physical altercations at media events. He has called out other fighters' wives, their kids, their backgrounds, their politics, their religion. There is no topic he will not touch. The reason he is not higher than 5 is because Strickland is not really doing trash talk in the traditional sense. He is just talking all the time about everything. He does not target one opponent and build a feud. He insults everyone equally and constantly. He is a stream of consciousness on legs. The trash talk leaks out as a side effect of the fact that he never stops speaking. That makes it less surgical than the levels above him, but the volume is unmatched. That is level 5. Constant, unfiltered, insane in a way that the UFC has tried and failed to control. Level 6. Level 6 is Colby Covington. Colby is one of the most hated fighters in UFC history, and he built that hatred deliberately. 2-time welterweight title challenger, former interim champion. He went 17-4 in the UFC with wins over Rafael dos Anjos, Demian Maia, Robbie Lawler, and Tyron Woodley. And every single one of those fights came with weeks of pre-fight content where Colby insulted the opponent in the most personal way possible. He went after Rafael dos Anjos' home country and called Brazilians filthy animals. He went after Tyron Woodley's family. He went after Kamaru Usman's late father, holding up a photo of him at a press conference after Usman's father had passed away. He wore MAGA hats to weigh-ins. He brought political costumes to face-offs. He filmed videos at Mar-a-Lago. He turned every single fight build-up into a calculated attack on the opponent's nationality, family, religion, or politics. The reason Colby is level 6 and not level 7 is that you can see the strategy. The whole thing is a character character. He is doing what Chael Sonnen taught him. Pick a heel persona and never break it. Get people to pay to see you lose. He turned trash talk into a business model. It worked for years. Title shots, pay-per-view headliners, a career of fighting bigger names than he probably deserved on his record. But it is performance. That is level 6, the most calculated trash talk in UFC history. Personal, cruel, always on, always selling. Level 7. Level 7 is Conor McGregor. Conor is the greatest trash talker in the history of combat sports, and there is no real argument. 2-division UFC champion. The first man to hold belts in 2 weight classes simultaneously. The biggest pay-per-view star the sport has ever produced. Every single thing he ever achieved was built on the back of his mouth. Conor did not just talk trash. Conor invented entire feuds out of nothing. He called Jose Aldo's village a dump and said he would invade Rio on horseback. He told Aldo he would have killed him if it was a different time period. He told Eddie Alvarez he was going to break his face and then did it. He stole Dustin Poirier's belt at the press conference and slammed it on the table. He told Floyd Mayweather to dance for him. He gave Khabib's father a heart attack with the things he said about his family. He threw a hand truck through a bus window and started a riot. He pulled up to a press conference in a Rolls Royce wearing a fur coat that cost more than most fighters earn in a career. Every press conference he attended became a moment. Every face-off became a meme. The May 2017 build-up with Mayweather did 4.3 million pay-per-view buys, the second highest in boxing history, almost entirely because Conor talked it into being the biggest event in combat sports that year. His promotion of his trilogy with Nate Diaz did 1.6 million pay-per-view buys for UFC 202 alone. He turned UFC 205 into the highest grossing event in MSG history. The volume is one thing, the skill is another. Conor's trash talk has structure. He sets up jokes and lands them. He builds catchphrases. He picks targets and stays on them for months. He knows when to be funny and when to be vicious. He knows when to speak softly and when to scream. The whole sport copied him. Every fighter who has tried to talk their way to a title shot in the last decade has been doing a worse version of what Conor did first. Strickland is louder. Colby is more calculated, but neither of them moved the needle the way Conor did at his peak. He is the reason the UFC is a billion-dollar promotion. He is the reason fighters today think they need a persona. He is the reason trash talk became a skill instead of a side effect. That is level 7. The greatest trash talker who has ever lived. The blueprint everyone else is still copying.
Every type of UFC knockout explained. The flash knockout. This is the one where a fighter is conscious and then they are not. There is no stumble. There is no wobble. The lights go out like someone flipped a switch. The flash knockout happens when a strike lands perfectly on the jaw or the temple and short-circuits the brain. The most famous example in UFC history is Conor McGregor knocking out Jose Aldo in 13 seconds at UFC 194. Aldo threw a right hand, McGregor slipped it, and landed a left counter that put Aldo face first into the canvas. Aldo was the featherweight champion for over a decade, and he was unconscious before he hit the ground. The flash knockout is about precision, not power. It is about catching the chin at the exact angle that causes the brain to bounce off the inside of the skull. When it happens, the fighter goes completely stiff. Their body locks up in what doctors call the fencing response, where the arms extend outward involuntarily. It is the most dramatic finish in the sport because there is no buildup. 1 second the fight is happening, and the next second it is over. The delayed reaction knockout. This is the knockout where a fighter gets hit clean but does not go down immediately. They take the shot, their legs wobble, and for a brief moment, they look like they might survive it. Then their body catches up with what their brain already knows, and they collapse. It is like watching someone try to stay standing on a boat in a storm. The most memorable example is Anderson Silva getting caught by Chris Weidman at UFC 162. Silva was showboating with his hands down, and Weidman threw a left hook that landed flush. Silva stumbled backward, tried to recover, and then crumbled to the mat where Weidman finished him with follow-up shots. The delayed reaction knockout happens because the initial impact scrambles the brain but does not immediately shut it down. The fighter's body runs on autopilot for a few seconds while the nervous system tries to reboot. It never does. The delay makes it more painful to watch because there is that split second where you think the fighter might be okay, and then you realize they are not. The walk-off knockout. The walk-off is the most iconic finish in MMA. It is when a fighter lands a shot so devastating that they know it is over before the referee does. They do not follow up with ground strikes. They do not dive in for the finish. They just turn and walk away because they know the other person is done. Mark Hunt was the king of the walk-off knockout. He hit people so hard with his right hand that he could feel it when they were finished. His knockout of Stefan Struve at UFC on Fuel TV is one of the greatest walk-offs in history. Hunt cracked Struve with an overhand right, and Struve fell backward like a tree. Hunt took one look at him, knew he was unconscious, and walked to the center of the octagon with his arms raised. The walk-off requires supreme confidence. If the fighter walks away and the opponent somehow recovers, the fight continues, and now you have given up your position. But when it works, and it almost always works, it is the coldest thing in combat sports. It says, "I hit you so hard that I do not even need to check if you are still conscious." The body shot knockout. This is the one that does not look like a knockout at all if you do not know what you are watching. The fighter does not get hit in the head. There is no flash, there is no wobble, they just crumble to the ground holding their midsection, and the fight is over. The body shot knockout happens when a strike lands directly on the liver, which sits on the right side of the body, just below the rib cage. The liver is one of the most sensitive organs in the human body, and when it takes a direct impact, it sends a shock wave through the nervous system that causes immediate and involuntary shutdown. The pain is so intense that the brain essentially overrides everything else and forces the body to collapse in a protective position. Bas Rutten built his entire career around body shots. He won the UFC heavyweight championship by destroying Kevin Randleman's body. More recently, Alistair Overeem's liver kick against Brock Lesnar at UFC 141 is one of the most famous body shot finishes ever. Lesnar ate a knee to the liver and dropped to the canvas in agony. The body shot knockout is the most underappreciated finish in MMA because casual fans often do not understand why the fighter went down. But anyone who has ever been hit clean in the liver knows exactly what happened. Your body simply stops working. The standing TKO. The standing TKO is when a fighter is getting hit with so many clean shots while on their feet that the referee steps in and stops the fight, even though the fighter never actually falls to the ground. It is a strange finish because the fighter is still technically standing, but they are no longer defending themselves intelligently. Their hands are down, their eyes are glazed, and they are eating shots without any response. Justin Gaethje's stoppage of Tony Ferguson at UFC 249 is the textbook standing TKO. Ferguson was taking enormous punishment in the 5th round. His face was destroyed. He was barely throwing back, and the referee stepped between them because continuing the fight would have been dangerous. The standing TKO requires a referee with good judgment because the line between a fighter who is hurt but still in the fight and a fighter who is absorbing unnecessary damage is thin. Some referees let it go too long, some stop it too early, but when the call is right, the standing TKO is the referee doing their most important job, which is protecting a fighter who can no longer protect themselves. The ground and pound TKO. This is the most common stoppage in MMA. A fighter gets taken down or dropped, and the opponent follows them to the ground and rains down punches and elbows until the referee stops it. The ground and pound TKO is not pretty. It is not the clean, one-shot knockout that makes highlight reels. It is sustained violence from a dominant position, and it is the bread and butter of how fights end in mixed martial arts. Khabib Nurmagomedov was the master of this. He would take his opponents down, pin them against the fence, and deliver short punches and elbows from the top position until they could no longer defend. His finish of Conor McGregor at UFC 229 was ground and pound at its most methodical. Khabib secured the position, removed McGregor's ability to escape, and then went to work until McGregor gave up his neck. The ground and pound TKO works because of positional dominance. When a fighter is on top in full mount or side control, the person on bottom cannot generate enough space to escape or enough leverage to block the strikes. It is suffocating. The punches might not be as powerful as standing strikes, but they are constant, and they accumulate until the fighter on the bottom stops responding. The slam knockout. The slam knockout is one of the most violent things that can happen in the octagon. It is when a fighter lifts their opponent off the ground and drives them headfirst into the canvas with enough force to knock them unconscious on impact. The physics are brutal. The fighter being slammed cannot brace for impact because they are airborne and they cannot control how they land. All of their body weight, plus the force of the slam, concentrates into whatever part of their body hits first, and if that is their head, the fight is over. Matt Hughes slamming Frank Trigg at UFC 52 is one of the most iconic slams in UFC history. Hughes was in trouble early, recovered, lifted Trigg off the ground, carried him across the octagon, and slammed him to the mat before finishing with a rear naked choke. Rampage Jackson's slam knockout of Ricardo Arona in Pride is the most devastating slam in MMA history period. Jackson picked Arona up while Arona was attempting a triangle choke, held him in the air, and powerbombed him into unconsciousness. The slam knockout is rare in modern MMA because fighters are much better at defending takedowns and controlling their body position in the air. But when it happens, it is a reminder that combat sports at their core are about controlled violence. And sometimes, that violence is a 200-pound human being driven into the earth. The head kick knockout. The head kick knockout is the most spectacular finish in the sport. It combines flexibility, timing, and devastating power into a single movement that can end any fight instantly, regardless of size or toughness. The shin bone is the hardest striking surface on the human body, and when it connects with the temple or the jaw at full speed, the result is almost always catastrophic. Edson Barboza's wheel kick knockout of Terry Edom at UFC 142 is widely considered the greatest head kick knockout in UFC history. Barboza spun and landed a perfectly timed wheel kick that hit Edom flush on the jaw.
Edom was unconscious before he hit the ground, and he lay motionless on the canvas for what felt like an eternity.
Holly Holm's head kick of Ronda Rousey at UFC 193 changed the entire trajectory of women's MMA. Rousey had never been beaten. She was considered invincible, and Holm timed a left high kick that caught Rousey on the neck as Rousey charged forward recklessly. The head kick knockout requires more setup than any other finish because the head is a small target, and kicking that high leaves the attacker vulnerable to counters and takedowns. But when a fighter times it perfectly, there is no more devastating weapon in mixed martial arts: the doctor stoppage. The doctor stoppage is the most frustrating finish in MMA for fans and fighters alike. It happens when a cut or an injury becomes severe enough that the cage-side doctor examines the fighter between rounds and determines that continuing the fight would be medically dangerous. The most common cause is a deep laceration near the eye. Cuts above the eyebrow bleed into the eye and obstruct vision, and if the cut is deep enough or positioned badly enough, the doctor will wave the fight off. The frustration comes from the fact that the fighter who gets stopped is often still competitive. They might be winning the fight on the scorecards. They might feel fine, but the doctor's job is not to determine who is winning. It is to determine whether continuing the fight poses an unacceptable medical risk. Nate Diaz's loss to Jorge Masvidal at UFC 244 is the most controversial doctor stoppage in recent memory. Diaz was cut badly, but he is a fighter who always gets cut, and he was still very much in the fight. The doctor stopped it after the third round, and the arena erupted in boos. Doctor stoppages are part of the sport because MMA is sanctioned by athletic commissions that have a legal obligation to protect fighters, but they will never sit well with fans who came to watch a fight and watched a doctor end one instead.
The knee knockout. The knee is one of the most underrated knockout weapons in MMA. It does not get the same attention as punches or head kicks, but it has produced some of the most devastating finishes in UFC history. The knee works because it generates enormous power over a very short distance. A fighter does not need a full windup to throw a devastating knee. They just need their opponent to change levels or move their head forward at the wrong moment. Jorge Masvidal's flying knee knockout of Ben Askren at UFC 239 is the fastest knockout in UFC history at 5 seconds. Askren ducked his head on the approach, and Masvidal sprinted across the octagon and drove his knee through Askren's skull. Askren was unconscious instantly. It was over before it started. The knee from the clinch is equally dangerous. Adesanya's knee that dropped Brunson in their first fight was a perfectly timed strike that caught Brunson changing levels. The knee knockout is devastating because the knee is a bone striking a skull, and at close range, there is almost no way to absorb the impact. It just goes straight through.
Every pressure point used in combat sports explained. The button. The button is the point of the chin. It is the single most targeted pressure point in all of combat sports, and the reason every coach in every gym on the planet says keep your chin tucked. The jaw is connected to the skull by the temporomandibular joint, and when a strike lands flush on the chin, it acts as a lever that rotates the skull rapidly. That rapid rotation causes the brain to shift inside the skull cavity, and when the brain moves fast enough, it essentially short circuits. The signals between neurons get disrupted, and the body shuts down. That is what a knockout is. It is not about pain. It is about the brain being unable to maintain consciousness because it has been rattled inside its casing. Every knockout artist in UFC history targets the button. Conor McGregor's left hand was so effective because he aimed for the very tip of the chin where the leverage is greatest. A punch that lands even 2 inches higher on the cheek generates significantly less rotational force. The button is the reason fighters wear mouth guards, not to protect the teeth, although that helps, but to stabilize the jaw so that impact on the chin does not cause the jaw to snap shut and add a secondary concussive force from the mandible slamming into the upper skull. The temple. The temple is the thinnest part of the skull. It sits on either side of the head, just behind and above the eye, and beneath it runs the middle meningeal artery, which supplies blood to the protective lining of the brain. A direct strike to the temple is dangerous for 2 reasons. First, because the bone is thin, the impact transmits more force to the brain than a strike to the thicker frontal bone or the back of the skull. Second, if the middle meningeal artery is ruptured, it can cause an epidural hematoma, which is bleeding between the skull and the brain lining that creates pressure on the brain.
This is the reason that head kicks are so devastating. The shin bone connecting with the temple at full force transmits an enormous amount of energy through the thinnest part of the skull directly into the brain. Edson Barboza's wheel kick that knocked out Terry Edom landed on the temple. Holly Holm's kick that knocked out Ronda Rousey connected behind the ear near the temple. The temple is why fighters keep their hands high. A standard boxing guard with the hands up beside the head is designed specifically to protect the chin and the temple simultaneously, because those are the 2 spots where a clean strike is most likely to cause unconsciousness. The liver. The liver is the body's most vulnerable organ to impact, and it is the reason body shots can end fights just as effectively as headshots. The liver sits on the right side of the body, just below the rib cage, partially protected by the lower ribs, but exposed enough that a well-placed hook, kick, or knee can reach it. When the liver takes a direct impact, it triggers what is called a vasovagal response. The vagus nerve, which runs through the area, sends an emergency signal to the brain that causes an immediate drop in heart rate and blood pressure. The result is involuntary collapse. The fighter does not choose to go down. Their body forces them down as a protective mechanism. The pain has been described by fighters as the worst thing they have ever felt. It radiates through the entire torso. It makes breathing feel impossible, and it creates a sense of total helplessness. Bas Rutten was the greatest liver shot artist in MMA history. He targeted the liver with palm strikes, hooks, and knees, and his opponents would crumble in agony. The liver shot is one of the hardest techniques to defend in combat sports, because protecting the body means lowering the hands, which exposes the head. Fighters are constantly making a calculation between head protection and body protection, and the ones who forget about the liver pay for it. The solar plexus. The solar plexus is a network of nerves located in the center of the abdomen, just below the sternum where the rib cage ends. It is one of the largest nerve clusters in the body, and it controls involuntary functions including breathing. When a strike lands directly on the solar plexus, it causes a diaphragmatic spasm, which is the medical term for getting the wind knocked out of you. The diaphragm contracts involuntarily, and the fighter cannot inhale. For a few seconds that feel like an eternity, they are unable to breathe. The panic of not being able to draw air while someone is trying to hit you is one of the most terrifying experiences in combat sports. A perfectly placed front kick or teep to the solar plexus can freeze a fighter in place. Anderson Silva's front kick knockout of Vitor Belfort at UFC 126 targeted the chin, but the technique itself is the same one that fighters use to attack the solar plexus. A teep kick that drives the ball of the foot into the solar plexus is one of the most effective range management tools in MMA, because even if it does not knock the wind out of the opponent, the fear of that happening changes how they move forward. Behind the ear. The area behind the ear is one of the most dangerous strike zones in combat sports. The mastoid process, which is the bony bump behind the ear, sits directly above the brainstem, which controls the body's most basic functions, including consciousness, breathing, and heart rate. A strike that lands behind the ear transmits force directly to the brainstem and the vestibular system, which controls balance and spatial orientation. This is why strikes behind the ear cause instant disorientation and often produce knockouts where the fighter collapses without any visible wobble or stumble.
they just drop. The back of the head is an illegal strike zone in MMA, specifically because of the proximity to the brainstem. But strikes that land behind the ear on the side of the head are legal, and they are devastating.
Many head kick knockouts that look like they landed on the jaw actually connected behind the ear, which is why the fighter went down so suddenly. The vestibular system is also why spinning attacks are so disorienting, even when they do not knock a fighter out. A spinning back fist that clips behind the ear scrambles the balance system and makes the fighter feel like the entire cage is moving, even if they are still conscious. The floating ribs. The floating ribs are the two lowest ribs on each side of the body. Unlike the upper ribs, which are connected to the sternum by cartilage, the floating ribs are attached only to the spine and hang freely at the bottom of the rib cage. This makes them extremely vulnerable to body strikes because there is no structural support on the front end to absorb impact. When a hook, kick, or knee connects with the floating ribs, they can crack or break, and a broken floating rib creates a cascade of problems for a fighter. Every breath hurts. Every twist of the torso sends a jolt of pain through the body. Defensive movements that require core rotation become agonizing. Fighters with broken ribs cannot generate power on their punches because the torque required to throw a hard punch starts in the hips and transfers through the core. And if the core is damaged, the entire kinetic chain breaks down. Bas Rutten targeted the floating ribs obsessively. Body kicks from southpaw fighters are particularly effective at reaching the floating ribs on the right side of an orthodox fighter's body because the angle of the kick slides past the elbow guard and connects with the unprotected lower rib cage. The peroneal nerve. The peroneal nerve runs along the outside of the leg just below the knee. It is the reason leg kicks work. When a fighter throws a low kick and connects with the outer thigh or just below the knee, they are driving their shin bone into the peroneal nerve, which controls the muscles that lift the foot and stabilize the ankle. Repeated impacts to the peroneal nerve cause the leg to go numb, then weak, and eventually non-functional. The fighter cannot put weight on it, they cannot push off it, they cannot maintain their stance. The calf kick, which became a dominant weapon in MMA starting around 2020, targets the peroneal nerve even more directly because the calf muscle offers less padding than the thigh. Dustin Poirier's calf kicks against Conor McGregor at UFC 264 are a textbook example. McGregor's lead leg was being destroyed by kicks that landed directly on the peroneal nerve, and by the third round, his movement was severely compromised. Jose Aldo built his entire striking game around leg kicks that targeted the peroneal nerve. His leg kicks against Uriah Faber left Faber's legs bruised purple from hip to knee. The peroneal nerve is the reason that a fighter can be perfectly fine mentally, but physically unable to continue because one of their legs has been kicked so many times that it simply stops working. The throat. Strikes directly to the throat are illegal in MMA, but the throat remains one of the most important pressure points in combat sports because of its role in chokes and submissions. The trachea sits at the front of the throat, and the carotid arteries run along either side. Submissions that compress the throat target one or both of these structures. A trachea choke, sometimes called a wind choke or an air choke, works by compressing the windpipe and preventing the fighter from breathing. It is slow and painful. A blood choke works by compressing the carotid arteries and cutting off blood flow to the brain. It is fast, and the fighter loses consciousness in as little as 4 seconds. The rear naked choke, the guillotine, the triangle, and the darce all target the structures of the throat in different ways. The throat is also why fighters instinctively tuck their chin during ground exchanges. Exposing the throat in any grappling position is an invitation for a choke, and even a poorly applied choke that only partially compresses the throat creates enough discomfort and panic to drain a fighter's energy as they fight to escape. The sciatic nerve. The sciatic nerve is the largest nerve in the human body. It runs from the lower back through the buttock and down the back of each leg. Strikes that target the back of the thigh, particularly knees from the clinch and kicks to the hamstring, can impact the sciatic nerve and cause shooting pain and temporary numbness down the entire leg. The sciatic nerve is less commonly targeted than the peroneal nerve because it is deeper within the muscle and harder to reach with a single strike. But cumulative damage to the area around the sciatic nerve through body kicks and knees in the clinch creates a progressive deterioration of leg function that is different from the peroneal nerve attacks. Instead of the leg going numb from the outside, the fighter feels a deep, aching pain that makes every step feel heavy and every stance change feel sluggish. Fighters who work the inside leg kick are often inadvertently targeting the sciatic nerve. The inside leg kick lands on the inner thigh,
near the femoral nerve and the adductor muscles, but the impact radiates through the leg and affects the sciatic nerve pathway as well. The jaw hinge,
The temporomandibular joint, where the jaw connects to the skull, is one of the most sensitive areas on the human head. A strike that lands on the side of the jaw near the hinge point is particularly effective at causing knockouts, because the impact forces the jaw sideways and rotates the skull along its vertical axis. This rotational movement is what causes the brain to shift inside the skull and lose function. An uppercut targets the jaw hinge from below, driving the lower jaw upward into the upper jaw and transmitting force directly through the temporomandibular joint into the skull. A hook targets it from the side, snapping the jaw laterally. Both are devastating. The jaw hinge is also why fighters who have been knocked out sometimes have trouble opening their mouths for days afterward. The joint becomes inflamed from the impact, and the muscles around it seize up as a protective response. Junior Dos Santos built his career around a straight right hand that targeted the jaw hinge. His knockout of Kane Velasquez at UFC on Fox in 2011 was a perfect right hand that connected on the jaw hinge and sent Velasquez to the canvas in 64 seconds. The jaw hinge is the intersection of structural vulnerability and mechanical leverage, and it is the reason that even a relatively light punch can cause a knockout if it hits the exact right spot. Every type of UFC referee stoppage explained. The early stoppage. The early stoppage is the most controversial call a referee can make. It happens when a referee steps in and ends the fight while the hurt fighter still appears to be defending themselves or still has a chance to recover. The crowd boos, the losing fighter protests, the corner screams, and the debate rages for years afterward. The problem with judging an early stoppage is that referees are seeing things from a few feet away in real time that fans are watching in slow motion on replay. A referee sees a fighter absorb a clean shot, sees their eyes glaze over, sees their hands drop for half a second, and makes a split-second decision that the fighter is no longer defending themselves intelligently. From the couch, it looks early. From 3 feet away, with a 200-pound man raining down punches, it looks like the right call. The most debated early stoppage in UFC history is arguably the Steve Mazzagatti stoppage of the first Gray Maynard versus Frankie Edgar fight. Mazzagatti stopped it while Edgar was still moving, and many felt Edgar could have recovered. The reality of early stoppages is that for every one that looks premature, there are dozens of situations where the referee stepping in early saved a fighter from unnecessary brain damage. The referee's job is not to let fighters be warriors. It is to prevent permanent injury. And that means sometimes stopping a fight 30 seconds before the fighter would have stopped it themselves. The late stoppage. The late stoppage is the one that makes people uncomfortable. It happens when a referee allows a fight to continue well past the point where a reasonable person would have stopped it. The hurt fighter is absorbing unanswered strikes. Their hands are down. They are not moving intelligently, and the referee stands there watching while the other fighter lands 5, 10, 15 more shots than necessary. The late stoppage is worse than the early stoppage because the consequences are real and permanent. Every unnecessary punch to an unconscious or semi-conscious fighter is brain damage that did not need to happen. The most notorious late stoppage in UFC history is Mario Yamasaki's handling of the Valentina Shevchenko versus Priscilla Cachoeira fight at UFC Fight Night in February 2018. Shevchenko was brutalizing Cachoeira for an extended period, and Yamasaki let it continue long after any reasonable standard of fighter safety had been violated. Dana White publicly said Yamasaki would never referee a UFC fight again, and he was right. Late stoppages happen because some referees subscribe to the philosophy of giving fighters every possible chance to recover. That philosophy sounds noble until you watch a fighter take 30 unanswered shots to the head while lying motionless on the canvas. The referee is the last line of defense between a fighter and catastrophic injury, and a late stoppage is a failure of that responsibility. The doctor. Stoppage. The doctor stoppage happens when the cage-side physician determines that a fighter's injury, usually a cut, is severe enough that continuing the fight would pose an unacceptable medical risk. Between rounds, the referee calls the doctor into the cage. The doctor examines the cut, checks if the fighter can see, checks if the laceration is deep enough to compromise the structural integrity of the area around the eye, and makes a decision. If the doctor waves the fight off, the fighter with the cut loses by TKO, regardless of how the fight was going on the scorecards. This is what makes the doctor's stoppage so frustrating. A fighter can be winning 4 rounds to 0 and lose because of a cut from an accidental headbutt in the 5th round. The most famous doctor stoppage in recent UFC history is the stoppage of the Jorge Masvidal versus Nate Diaz fight at UFC 244 for the BMF belt. Diaz had significant cuts around his eyes, and the doctor stopped the fight after 3 rounds. Diaz was furious. The crowd was furious. But the doctor's job is not to consider the stakes of the fight or the heart of the fighter. The doctor's job is to assess whether the injury could lead to something worse if the fight continues, and a deep laceration near the eye can lead to permanent vision damage if it gets worse. The corner stoppage. The corner stoppage is the most emotionally charged stoppage in MMA. It happens when a fighter's own corner throws in the towel or tells the referee between rounds that their fighter is done. The corner stoppage requires a coach to prioritize their fighter's long-term health over the outcome of the fight. And that decision is never easy, because fighters almost never want to quit. They will sit on the stool between rounds with a broken orbital bone and tell their corner they can see fine. They will lie about how they feel because the competitive drive overrides the pain. The corner's job is to see through the lie and protect the fighter from themselves. The most significant corner stoppage in UFC history is the stoppage of the Justin Gaethje versus Tony Ferguson fight at UFC 249. Ferguson's corner stopped the fight between the 4th and 5th rounds after Ferguson had absorbed enormous punishment. It was the right call. Ferguson could barely see, his face was destroyed, and Gaethje was landing at will. But the stoppage ended Ferguson's 12-fight win streak, and many believe the damage he sustained that night was the beginning of his permanent decline. Corner stoppages are rare because many corners are afraid to stop the fight. They worry about their fighter being angry at them. They worry about looking weak. But the best corners in the sport understand that their fighter will have to live in their body for the next 50 years, and one fight is never worth sacrificing that. The standing TKO. The standing TKO happens when a fighter is absorbing damage on their feet without offering any meaningful offense or defense in return. The referee steps between the fighters and waves the fight off, even though the losing fighter is still technically standing. The standing TKO requires precise judgment from the referee because the line between a fighter who is hurt and a fighter who is defenseless is not always clear. A hurt fighter might shell up, absorb a few shots, and then fire back with something that changes the fight. A defenseless fighter is absorbing shots with no response and no plan, and the only thing keeping them upright is momentum and stubbornness. Nate Diaz's loss to Josh Thompson at UFC on Fox in 2013 was a standing TKO. Diaz was eating head kicks against the fence, and the referee stepped in because Diaz was no longer protecting himself, even though he was still on his feet. The standing TKO is more common at heavyweight, where the power of every punch is significant enough that allowing a compromised fighter to stay in the pocket is genuinely dangerous. At lighter weight classes, referees tend to give fighters more time because the finishing power is lower and the chance of recovery is higher. But at any weight, if a fighter is standing in front of their opponent, eating clean shots without responding, the referee has every reason to stop it. The verbal submission. The verbal submission is when a fighter tells the referee they are done, either by saying they quit, screaming in pain, or verbally tapping out. It is different from a physical tap because there is no hand signal. The referee hears the fighter say something and makes the call to stop the fight. This has led to some of the most controversial finishes in UFC history, because in the chaos of a fight, it can be hard to distinguish between a fighter who is screaming in pain and a fighter who is verbally submitting.
The most infamous verbal submission controversy was the Frank Mir versus Tim Sylvia fight at UFC 48, where Sylvia's arm broke from a Kimura. Sylvia protested the stoppage, even though his arm was clearly broken, because he claimed he never tapped and never said he quit. The referee heard what he interpreted as a verbal submission and stopped the fight. Verbal submissions from strikes are even more controversial. A fighter getting hit repeatedly might yell out in pain, and the referee might interpret that as a verbal submission, even though the fighter intended to continue. The verbal submission is a reminder that fights are controlled by human beings making real-time judgments in extremely loud and chaotic environments, and sometimes those judgments
counts are imperfect. The no contest. The no contest is the stoppage that satisfies nobody. It happens when a fight is stopped due to an accidental foul, usually an illegal strike, and the fouled fighter cannot continue, but the fight has not gone far enough for the scorecards to determine a winner. If the accidental foul occurs in the first 2 rounds, the fight is typically declared a no contest. If it occurs in the 3rd round or later, the fight goes to the scorecards at the time of the stoppage. The most common cause of a no contest is an accidental eye poke or an accidental headbutt that causes a cut too severe to continue. The no contest is frustrating because both fighters prepared for weeks, cut weight, and walked to the cage, and neither of them gets a result. It goes on their record as a blemish that tells no story. The most high-profile no contest in UFC history is arguably the first fight between Anderson Silva and Nick Diaz, which was overturned to a no contest after both fighters tested positive for banned substances. No contests from fouls are a reminder that MMA rules exist for a reason, and that accidental violations of those rules can derail entire fight cards. The disqualification. The disqualification is the rarest stoppage in the UFC. It happens when a fighter commits an intentional foul that either prevents the fight from continuing or is so egregious that the referee decides the offending fighter should lose. Disqualifications are rare because referees are trained to give fighters the benefit of the doubt and treat most fouls as accidental. Point deductions are far more common than disqualifications. But when a foul is clearly intentional and clearly affects the outcome of the fight, the referee has the authority to disqualify the offending fighter on the spot. The most famous disqualification in UFC history is Petr Yan's illegal knee to Aljamain Sterling at UFC 259. Sterling was grounded, and Yan threw a knee that landed clean on Sterling's head. A knee to the head of a grounded opponent is illegal, and the referee disqualified Yan, making Sterling the bantamweight champion by disqualification. Sterling was widely mocked for winning the belt that way, even though he did nothing wrong. The disqualification is the stoppage that nobody wants to be part of. The winner did not really win, the loser did not really lose in a competitive sense, and the fans feel like they were cheated out of a real finish. The submission stoppage. The submission stoppage happens when a referee stops a fight because a fighter is caught in a submission but does not tap. Instead of submitting, the fighter goes unconscious from a choke or suffers visible joint damage from a lock, and the referee intervenes to prevent further injury. The submission stoppage is different from a tap because the fighter never gave up. They chose to go to sleep rather than submit, which is either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish, depending on your perspective. When a fighter is caught in a rear naked choke and refuses to tap, they have approximately 6 to 10 seconds before they lose consciousness from blood flow restriction to the brain. If the referee does not see the tap, they have to watch the fighter's body for signs of unconsciousness. The arms go limp, the eyes close, the body stops resisting. At that point, the referee pulls the attacker off, and the fight is over. The submission stoppage happens more often with chokes than with joint locks, because fighters are generally willing to tap to arm locks and leg locks rather than risk a broken limb. But with chokes, some fighters would rather go unconscious than tap, because going unconscious does not carry the same perceived stigma as tapping out. The practical difference is zero. You lost either way. But the psychology of fighting is not always practical. The towel throw. The towel throw is the most dramatic version of the corner stoppage. Instead of waiting for the round to end and talking to the referee, a cornerman physically throws a towel into the octagon to signal that their fighter is done. The towel throw is immediate and impossible to ignore. It overrides the fighter's desire to continue and forces the referee to stop the action. The towel throw carries enormous weight because it is a public declaration that the fighter cannot continue, and it is made by someone other than the fighter. In boxing, the towel throw has a long and storied history. In MMA, it is less common, but equally impactful. The towel throw sometimes creates conflict between fighters and their corners, because the fighter may feel they could have continued, while the corner knows they were taking too much damage. The emotional aftermath of a towel throw can fracture the relationship between a fighter and their coach if the fighter believes the stoppage cost them a chance at victory. But the best corners understand that throwing the towel is sometimes the most
most important thing they will ever do for their fighter, because the fighter is too deep in the moment to make the decision for themselves.
Every type of illegal move in combat sports explained. The 12-6 elbow. The 12-6 elbow is the most debated illegal technique in MMA. It is an elbow strike thrown in a straight downward motion, like the movement of a clock hand going from 12 to 6. The technique was banned by the unified rules of MMA because the Athletic Commission members who wrote the rules watched a demonstration of martial artists breaking blocks of ice with downward elbows and decided the technique was too dangerous for competition. This is not a joke. That is actually how the rule was created. The controversy exists because horizontal and diagonal elbows are legal and they generate equal or greater force than a downward elbow in most situations. Jon Jones's only career loss before his heavyweight run was a disqualification for 12-6 elbows against Matt Hamill at the Ultimate Fighter finale in 2009. Jones was dominating Hamill on the ground and threw downward elbows that the referee deemed illegal. The result was changed to a disqualification loss, which became the only blemish on Jones's record for over a decade. The 12-6 elbow rule has been revised in some jurisdictions, and there is an ongoing push to remove it from the unified rules entirely because the biomechanical reasoning behind the ban does not hold up to modern analysis. But for now, if you throw your elbow straight down, you are breaking the rules. Soccer kicks and stomps. Soccer kicks and stomps to the head of a grounded opponent are legal in some promotions, but banned in the UFC under the unified rules of MMA. A soccer kick is exactly what it sounds like. A fighter kicks the head of an opponent who is on the ground the same way you would kick a soccer ball. A stomp is a downward strike with the foot to the head or body of a grounded opponent. Both techniques were legal in Pride Fighting Championships in Japan, where some of the most devastating finishes in MMA history came from soccer kicks to downed opponents. Wanderlei Silva was notorious for soccer kicking opponents in Pride, and the violence of those finishes is part of what led to the techniques being banned in American MMA.
The argument for banning soccer kicks is that a grounded fighter cannot move their head out of the way effectively, and the force generated by a full soccer kick to the skull of someone lying on the ground is potentially lethal. The argument against the ban is that fighters in the UFC already throw knees and punches to the head of grounded opponents, which can generate similar force. The distinction between what is allowed and what is not when it comes to strikes on the ground has always been one of the most inconsistent areas of MMA rules. Groin strikes. Groin strikes are illegal in MMA, but they happen constantly. A low kick that slips inside the thigh, a knee in the clinch that goes off target, a body kick that drops a few inches too low. Groin strikes are one of the most common fouls in the sport, and every fighter has experienced them. The rules give the fouled fighter up to 5 minutes to recover from a groin strike before the fight continues. If the fighter cannot continue after 5 minutes, the result depends on whether the foul was deemed accidental or intentional. Most groin strikes are accidental, and the fight continues after a brief break. The groin is a target that fighters instinctively protect by wearing a cup, which is a hard protective shell that covers the groin area. The cup absorbs most of the impact, but a direct strike to the groin can still cause severe pain even through the cup, because the impact compresses the soft tissue against the pelvic bone. Alistair Overeem's groin kick on Brock Lesnar at UFC 141, while not the strike that ended the fight, was a moment that showed how even a glancing blow to the groin can change the entire dynamic of a fight. Some fighters have been accused of using groin strikes strategically, throwing low kicks that accidentally land in the groin to slow down an aggressive opponent and force a break in the action. Eye pokes. The eye poke is the foul that has caused more controversy in MMA than any other. It happens when a fighter's fingers make contact with the opponent's eye, either by accident or through reckless hand positioning. The original UFC gloves had open fingers that pointed straight forward, which meant that any time a fighter extended their hand to measure distance or frame against an opponent, their fingers were pointed directly at the opponent's eyes. Jon Jones was criticized for years for extending his lead hand with fingers pointing forward, which resulted in multiple eye pokes against opponents, including Daniel Cormier.
The UFC eventually introduced curved gloves, designed to keep the fingers pointed inward. But eye pokes continue to happen, because the gloves cannot completely override the natural extension of the fingers. An eye poke can cause temporary blindness, corneal abrasions, and in severe cases, permanent vision damage. The fouled fighter gets up to 5 minutes to recover, and if they cannot see well enough to continue, the fight is either declared a no contest or a disqualification, depending on whether the foul was accidental or intentional. The eye poke is the foul that has arguably changed the most fight outcomes, because even a brief loss of vision in one eye changes everything about a fighter's distance perception and defensive timing. Fishhooking. Fishhooking is one of the most primal and disturbing fouls in combat sports. It involves inserting a finger or fingers into the mouth, nose, or any other orifice of an opponent and pulling. The term comes from the fishing motion of hooking a finger inside the cheek and pulling outward, which can tear the skin at the corner of the mouth. Fishhooking is banned because it causes immediate tissue damage that has nothing to do with fighting skill and everything to do with inflicting pain through methods that no amount of training can defend against. A fighter caught in a submission cannot use technique to escape a finger hooked inside their mouth, tearing their cheek open. Fishhooking is one of the original banned techniques from the early days of the UFC, when the promotion was transitioning from a no-rules spectacle to a regulated sport. The foul is rare in modern MMA because fighters know that a fishhook will result in an immediate point deduction or disqualification, and the stigma of using such a technique is significant. But in the chaos of a grappling exchange, particularly when a fighter is desperate to escape a choke, hands can end up in places they should not be, and accidental fishhooks do occasionally occur.
Strikes to the back of the head. Strikes to the back of the head are illegal because of the proximity to the brainstem. The back of the skull is divided into a legal zone and an illegal zone by an imaginary line called the Mohawk line, which runs from ear to ear over the top of the head. Anything behind that line is the back of the head, and striking it is a foul. The brainstem controls the body's most critical involuntary functions, including breathing, heart rate, and consciousness. A direct impact to the brainstem can cause immediate loss of consciousness, respiratory failure, and in extreme cases, death. This is not theoretical. Deaths in combat sports from strikes to the back of the head have occurred, and the rule exists specifically to prevent them. The difficulty with enforcing this rule is that in the chaos of a fight, particularly during ground and pound and clinch exchanges, strikes frequently land on the border between the legal and illegal zones. Referees have to make real-time judgments about whether a punch landed on the side of the head, which is legal, or the back of the head, which is not. Fighters in turtle position are particularly vulnerable because their head is down, and the back of the skull is the most exposed target. The rule is imperfect, but the alternative, which is allowing unrestricted strikes to the back of the head, would make MMA significantly more dangerous than it already is. Headbutts. Headbutts were legal in the early UFC, and they were brutally effective. The forehead is one of the hardest parts of the human skull, and driving it into the nose, orbital bone, or jaw of an opponent generates enormous impact force over a very small surface area. Mark Coleman used headbutts from the top position in the early UFC events, and the damage was horrific. His opponents would end up with broken noses and orbital fractures from repeated headbutts delivered from mount. Headbutts were banned because they created an unfair advantage for wrestlers who could take their opponents down and then use headbutts from top position with almost no defensive recourse available to the bottom fighter. You cannot block a headbutt from someone who is lying on top of you with their full body weight behind it. The accidental headbutt remains one of the most common causes of cuts in modern MMA. When fighters are in the clinch or scrambling on the ground, accidental head collisions happen frequently, and the resulting cuts can change or stop fights. The head is the hardest weapon on the human body, and when it collides with the softer bones around the eyes and nose, the softer bones lose every time. Small joint manipulation. Small joint manipulation means grabbing and bending individual fingers or toes. It is banned in MMA because the fingers and toes are fragile structures that can be broken with minimal force, and targeting them has nothing to do with fighting ability. In a grappling exchange, a fighter could grab a single finger and snap it backward, breaking it instantly and compromising the opponent's ability to grip, grapple, or even make a fist. The rule against small joint manipulation does not apply to the wrist or larger joints. Wrist locks are legal in MMA, as are attacks on the elbow, shoulder, knee,
and ankle. The distinction is based on the size of the joint and the amount of force required to damage it. A wrist lock requires meaningful technique and leverage. Snapping a finger requires almost none. Small joint manipulation was common in early no-rules fighting, and in some traditional martial arts where breaking fingers was considered a legitimate self-defense technique. In regulated combat sports, it is banned because allowing it would fundamentally change grappling exchanges in ways that would make the sport less about skill and more about who can grab a finger first. Biting. Biting is the most primitive foul in combat sports. It is banned in every regulated fighting promotion on Earth, and it carries an automatic disqualification in the UFC. Biting has appeared in professional MMA more times than people realize. When fighters are in deep grappling exchanges, particularly in choke attempts where the attacker's forearm is pressed against the defender's mouth, the temptation to bite is real. The human jaw exerts approximately 162 pounds of force per square inch, which is enough to break skin and cause significant tissue damage. Biting during a fight is not a technique. It is a survival response. When a fighter is being choked and feels their consciousness slipping away, the animal brain can override the rational brain, and the fighter bites without consciously deciding to do so. This does not excuse the foul, but it explains why it occurs even at the highest levels of the sport. The stigma of biting in a professional fight is enormous. A fighter who bites is seen as someone who has abandoned the martial arts entirely and resorted to something that belongs in a street fight, not a sanctioned competition. Fence grabbing. Fence grabbing is the most commonly unpunished foul in MMA. It happens when a fighter grabs the cage with their fingers or toes to prevent a takedown, improve their position, or stop themselves from being moved. The fence is supposed to be a neutral boundary. It defines the fighting area, but it is not supposed to be used as a tool. When a fighter grabs the fence to stop a takedown, they are using the structure of the cage to compensate for inferior wrestling, which is fundamentally unfair. The problem is that fence grabbing is almost impossible to punish consistently. Fighters grab the fence instinctively when they feel themselves being lifted or driven backward. The referee sees it, warns the fighter, and the fighter lets go. By that point, the takedown has already been stuffed, and the damage is done.
Repeat offenders rarely receive point deductions because referees are reluctant to take points away for something that happens so quickly and so instinctively. Daniel Cormier was criticized for fence grabbing during his fights. Gleison Tibau was accused of it. Dozens of fighters have stuffed takedowns by hooking their fingers through the cage and releasing before the referee could act. The fence grab is the parking ticket of MMA fouls. Everyone does it, nobody gets punished for it, and the fighters who benefit from it the most are the ones who are best at doing it subtly.
War Machine. His legal name is Jonathan Copenhaver. He fought in the UFC in 2007 under the name War Machine after legally changing it. He went 1-1 in the promotion before being released. He then fought in Bellator and on regional shows. On August 8, 2014, Copenhaver broke into the Las Vegas home of his ex-girlfriend, adult film actress Christy Mack. Mack's friend Corey Thomas was also in the apartment. Copenhaver beat Thomas unconscious and then turned on Mack. He beat her for nearly 2 hours. Mack suffered 18 broken bones, a ruptured liver, a lacerated kidney, and lost several teeth. She required extensive reconstructive surgery. Copenhaver fled the scene and was a fugitive for 10 days before being apprehended at a hotel in Simi Valley, California. In March 2017, he was found guilty on 29 of 34 charges, including sexual assault, kidnapping, and coercion. He was sentenced to 36 years to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 36 years. He will be eligible for parole in 2050 at the earliest. Jon Jones, the hit and run. On April 26, 2015, Jon Jones was the reigning UFC light heavyweight champion, widely considered the greatest fighter on the planet. At approximately noon that day in Albuquerque, New Mexico, Jones ran a red light and crashed his rental car into a vehicle driven by a pregnant woman. The woman suffered a broken arm. Jones fled the scene on foot. Witnesses saw him return to the vehicle briefly and grab a handful of cash and a marijuana pipe before running away again. He did not check on the other driver. He did not call for help. The pregnant woman was treated at a hospital and her baby was later born healthy. Jones was arrested and charged with felony hit and run. He pleaded guilty to a charge of leaving the scene of an accident. He was sentenced to 18 months of supervised probation. The UFC stripped him of his light heavyweight title. It was the beginning of a pattern that would define his career as much as his fighting ability. Jon Jones, domestic violence. On September 24, 2021, hours after being inducted into the UFC Hall of Fame in Las Vegas, Jon Jones was arrested at Caesars Palace. He was charged with misdemeanor domestic violence after allegedly headbutting his fiancée, Jessie Moses. He was also charged with felony injuring or tampering with a vehicle after allegedly damaging a Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department vehicle. Police body camera footage showed Jones with blood on his clothes. Moses was reportedly found with blood on her face and clothing. Jones was released on bail. The domestic violence charge was eventually resolved through a plea agreement. This was not an isolated incident. Jones has had multiple encounters with law enforcement over the years, including DUI arrests and a separate incident in 2019, where he was accused of slapping a waitress at a strip club in Albuquerque. Each time, the UFC has allowed him to return after serving his suspension. He remains on the active roster. Joe Sun. Joe Sun fought at UFC 4 in December 1994 in Tulsa, Oklahoma. He was Keith Hackney's opponent in a bout that is remembered primarily for Hackney repeatedly striking Sun in the groin, which was legal at the time. That fight is a curiosity in early UFC history. What happened after Joe Sun's fighting career is not. In 2008, Sun was arrested in connection with a gang rape that had occurred on Christmas Eve in 1990 in Orange County, California. The victim, a 20-year-old woman, had been abducted from a parking lot, driven to a remote location, and sexually assaulted by multiple men over the course of several hours. DNA evidence linked Sun to the crime nearly 18 years after it was committed. He pleaded guilty to 1 count of sexual